Hey everyone, welcome to our second event of Web3PMs. For those of you who don't know, Web3PMs is the first Web3 product community, and our goal is really to accelerate the development of Web3 by equipping product people with the skills and the resources and community to build for this age. We have more than 1,000 members and we're just getting started. So super excited to welcome you to our second event. And today we have Natalya with us. I'll let her share more about her story, but she has an incredible background. She's worked at BlackRock and X Moonshot, IDEO Collabs, and in the last few years has really focused on digital currencies at Stanford, Bretton Woods, and now at Knox. So super excited to dive into all of that with you. But Natalya, why don't we break the ice a little bit? Why don't you share a fun fact about you that most people don't know?
This is very random and not digital currency related in any way. But I have had lunch with Oprah and it was super cool. She had come to campus to meet with a few leaders when I was an undergrad, and was a very spiritual experience for sure. She's so wonderful. I think it's hard to find people who are like the same in person as they are on TV. And so it was great to meet her.
That's incredible. I mean, I would not forget something like that. That sounds awesome. Cool. So I love to ask people who are working in crypto kind of their origin story and how they got their start, and just walk us through like what really was that first introduction for you and like what really made it click for you.
Yeah. So this was back in 2015, and one of my mentors and I were at lunch, and she said, you should really look into this thing that's called blockchain and cryptocurrency. And at the time I was working on the capital markets team at BlackRock, and some of my team members were actually looking into potential new investment products or business use cases related to this. It was at that time that a lot of BlackRock clients were starting to ask about, what is this? Is BlackRock thinking about it? And so from there, I helped do a few things within my team, but then also was a part of helping put together the working group on blockchain and crypto for all of BlackRock. And a lot of that was education, exploring new products, new business use cases, new partnerships. And today, actually, BlackRock does have a digital assets team now. It's small, but it's, now BlackRock hires people to focus on that full time, which is really cool to see.
Yeah, that's an amazing transformation that a lot of companies and banks have to go through. And also just a good reminder to have mentors and check in with them, because you never know what conversation is going to like spark that whole new direction and pivot for you. And can you just share a little bit more about like what were some of those initial principles that got you so excited that you wanted to focus on this full time?
Yeah, I think at a broad scope, and it's so funny now that like people have said, oh, there's a rebranding Web3. I'm like, Web3 already existed, even not recently, but much long before. And I think the idea behind that was this idea of increased ownership and giving power back to the individual. And there's a lot of different types of products and services that stem out from that. But that was sort of what was really interesting to me.
That's awesome. Okay, so let's just slowly go through your journey. So you first had that initial interest, you were exploring at BlackRock. How did that lead you to starting Knox Network? And just talk to us about some of those pivotal moments in that journey.
Yeah, so I guess a lot of it started at BlackRock, like I previously mentioned. And I think from that, I started to get very involved with the crypto blockchain community in the Bay Area, and actually started to do a lot of even educational events for women in particular to kind of get more involved in the space, because I would go to all these events and just be the only woman in the room. And I was like, something here doesn't look right. Started to try to, I think from there, it was very clear that this industry was going to be huge, but there were a lot of moving parts. And a lot of people were like throwing spaghetti at walls and then sort of stepping back and saying, like, what's going to stick? Like, what's going to be, the first use case or the first thing that, gains traction. So I decided to go back to grad school, doing my public policy degree at Kennedy. I know someone already mentioned, chatted me about, can we talk about the joint degree? And then my MBA back at Stanford. And from there, I said, I'm just going to take the next 3 years to sort of like become an expert in one thing within the space and also explore, what else is going on. So that included not only taking a bunch of classes, but, publishing a lot of research with different professors and individuals in the industry. I organized like a digital currency simulation related to the digital yuan and US national security. I worked several jobs. I worked at Cello. I did a smaller kind of project at X. And from there, I was a part of the founding team of the Stanford Future Digital Currency Initiative. And, while, we've had changes in leadership within that org and, we ourselves are trying to, start something for the digital currency space, I would say I'm really kind of proud of the progress we've made. So basically the Stanford FDCI now today is a partnership between the Stanford Lab, the United Nations ITU, and a bunch of different private companies and also a few central banks. And a big part of that is trying to figure out how do we start to promote not only education around policymaking, but more importantly, promote research and technology creation, and then taking data from that technology and starting to use that in the conversations with the UN and other participants. As you can imagine, creating something that global is hard to manage. And I think we, saw a lot of growing pains in that first year, especially with COVID and stuff like that as well. But we're really excited about what have on the board for this upcoming year. And the other thing is, and this is more recent, has been kind of working with the Bretton Woods Digital Currency Project team under the Future of Finance Working Group. And there we're focused more on topical briefs that can be shared with public sector officials and kind of higher ups at different companies that are exploring the space. And then also focused on events and webinars and like small group roundtables.
That's awesome. And yeah, a lot to dig in there, but I think a few things that stood out to me is one, just those early days of crypto that you talked about where you were the only woman in the room. It's still true today. I think there's so many spaces that I'm a part of where there are no women voices. And so I think it's really important to call that out where it's there and just like encourage a more diverse set to be building in the space. Two was just that like engaging with the community was the first thing that you did was just like, let me just meet and talk to people and learn from it. And I think a lot of people who are interested in making the pivot to Web3 are just looking to get their first job. And that's also a great avenue, but it also can just be in the form of like, what are some projects and research that I can get involved with, or how can I just absorb and learn about the space and then write about the space and then kind of find your passion or niche and then make the transition. So I think that's an incredible story. So let's dig a little bit deeper into Knox. So when people say crypto, they already think about money and kind of the future of money, but what does that really mean? And how do you and how does Knox kind of think about that future of money?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I feel like let's just start with this idea of an ecology of money. And this is something that one of the leaders at Cello kind of mentioned, and I just love that phrase. Today we have cash, we have our PayPal Venmos, we have our cryptocurrencies, and there's an ecology of how we choose to hold different assets. And I think in the future, we can also expect that there are going to be different types of assets that sit besides one another. We can think of, the evolution of cash as maybe being what I like to coin as programmable money and other digital assets and cryptocurrencies that all sort of, sit side by side. I think when I also think about the future of money and just like payments more broadly, I think whether it's Web 2 or Web 3, within people's purview, people are just trying to make payments more frictionless, right? So on Web 2, you might have, your PayPal's, Venmos of the world. You have like the FedNow project that's going to launch in 2023. You have BIS's Nexus project, Swift GPI. There are all these different sort of like Web 2 approaches to like, how do we make payments faster? And then in Web 3, something that we've heard about more prominently are stable coins, right? So if people are using stable coins as a form of payment that are pegged to either basket of currencies, a single unit of currency or whatever, even if it's or algorithmic or hybrid, that would be also a way to make payments more frictionless, especially cross-border payments. At Knox, we're focused on what we are calling programmable money, which is basically the evolution of cash in your pocket. And so we're not quite a stable coin. And I always say, like one of many use cases of programmable money can be CBDC. We're like the natural evolution of the dollar bill in your pocket, but other use cases could be treasuries, repos, et cetera. It's like me asking, well, what's the use case of the dollar bill? And well, you could say, well, there are lots of use cases. So that's sort of like the grounding mechanism that we use to describe what we're working on. And we do imagine a future where, our programmable money sits alongside other variations of money that people are creating today or have already created. We don't think that there's any sense of like competition because there's always been an ecology of money and there will continue to be an ecology of money. I think most interestingly, because I come from like finance and like Web3, like digital assets background, people are like, well, is Knox like, you guys working on cryptocurrency? And I say, no, we're not working on cryptocurrency, but you can think of Knox as crypto adjacent. So we use a lot of the same types of building blocks of cryptocurrency, but they're manifested and sort of into a different product. So, we use cryptography, we use hashing, we're looking into zero knowledge proofs, range proofs, we use public private keys. We really think that, cryptocurrencies as they stand today can't be scaled across countries in the same way that, money today, like normal cash, can be scaled across countries. I think at Knox, we're really saying that any bank with like legal reserves, so like a local bank, a commercial bank, a large central bank, can map their digital money. We can all agree today money is digital. They can map their digital reserves, their legal reserves into our programmable system. You can kind of move money, without friction, and then off-ramp it back into the digital system. Or maybe in the future, you might want to off-ramp that programmable money into other Web3 assets. That could also be an existing future.
So they're kind of all an ecosystem that works together. Can you still break down a little bit deeper what the difference is between maybe like a blockchain and Ethereum and different stablecoins and what they don't do today compared to what programmable money does?
Yeah, so I guess let me kind of start on the programmable money side. So I think in existing solutions, this goes back to my point about like how people are trying to make payments faster. People are always trying to say like, let's take a single database, or like in the Web3 community, like take a layer one and try and move as many assets on that database as fast as we can. And I think for us, it's like flipping the solution on the head and trying to understand, if every sort of like unit of currency could be its own, traditional database, like we're not working in layer one solutions, like we're working more on, the traditional database side, then, you can reach a higher threshold of scalability. And I also think that the beauty of this is that then there's no single point of attack, right? You don't have like just one database system, you kind of have like many different mini databases kind of floating around. And that your funds for whatever like that unit of currency represents is available locally and then backed up by, whatever banks we're working with, like whatever authority system that they've said, yes, we verify that these funds are, legitimate and legal. Some of the other things that we are also, heavily focused on is sort of like thinking through, what do offline transactions look like in the system? How do we think about making this open source? We really believe that the future of finance is open source. And so that's something that isn't really standard today. And so how do we make that standard so that this can be more accessible and interoperable between different systems that exist today and systems that exist in the future? Other things that we're sort of focused on is making sure, we're not disintermediating the two-tier banking system. I think a lot of the times when you throw out the word like CBDC or digital currency, it's about the Fed having direct accounts with consumers. And the reality of it is like, they don't want to have that access. And commercial banks are huge to providing financial liquidity into the system. And then some of the other things we're looking at as well are sort of saying, we don't think like account-based systems really scale. And so trying to think through how should we be designing this, because we're not a stable coin, we're not account-based. We're looking at things like addressing double spend. I mentioned earlier, we have been looking into how do we make this like privacy enabled using zero knowledge proofs and stuff like that. Like how do we make sure that the consumer is protected in the way that they engage with financial transactions? And then the last one that's really, really important is this idea of interoperability with traditional and emerging financial standards, but also thinking about interoperability between different databases as well. To your question about, okay, well then how do some of the other like some of popular forms of digital currency compare? So I think with like stable coins in specific, because that's usually the example that comes up the most, you know, they're usually pegged to like one set of reserves, and then they can be affected by if like this or bank run, for example. Or, you know, stable coins just, I think, present a lot of added risks that include like loss of value, if there's stablecoin runs or fire sales, or there's a lack of consistent regulatory standards. And a lot of those kind of liquidity or run risks that stablecoins face make it hard to say that you're going to use a stablecoin to actually build a system that can work across different country regulations and different like financial standards across different countries. Which it goes back to where the programmable money is really interesting, because we're just mapping real reserves at any bank in any, you know, any country into kind of our programmable system. So I don't know, I'll pause there because I know that was a lot.
No, that was such a great overview, and it's so fascinating because, you know, you think you understand a space, and then you like, I think you just laid it out really well of what are some of the barriers of adoption of the current space and why there are advantages to this programmable money. But what are some of the barriers to adoption for programmable money, and what are some of the challenges that you kind of have to face with when building in this space?
Yeah, so I think it's less about programmable money. If we just took a step back and we said, you know, what are the barriers? Like I mentioned at the beginning, like programmable money has many different use cases. CBDCs is one of like the first use cases we're looking at, but there's a ton of others. Right now, because we're in the kind of like the thick of it, it's some of the barriers to adoptions for CBDCs are also some things that we're looking at and we're trying to solve for. So like the first is like this idea of like cybersecurity. Like if you have a government issue or a banking system issue CBDC, you can bet that there's going to be numerous sort of like hopeful or not hopeful, but like numerous cyber attacks that potentially come in. So something we're looking at there is like, how do we think about mitigating that? How do we think about making sure there's no single point of attack? And so that actually kind of goes back to a little bit of what I was talking about earlier in terms of our kind of system design. I think the second is this idea of disintermediation. You know, making sure that like, how do we design a system that still keeps the banks included in the dissemination of, you know, whatever this money ends up looking like or whatever it ends up being. The third, I would say, is monetary policy. There are all these, you know, papers you can read about like, oh, well, you can program CBDCs to do different things. But the thing is that when you program money to do certain things, there's also, you're introducing adverse risks, and that might include, you know, risks that the consumers bear, but that also could include, you know, competing with other financial instruments and assets that sit at these banks. So like, how do we really think about, you know, making sure that the analytics and the data you can pull from this programmable money is worth it for the institutions, but not also posing risk to either institution or consumer. And then the last is kind of scalability. Like, how do you build a super scalable system that still, you know, preserves the privacy of the people engaging with the system? And I think this is not even a CBDC or a digital currency question. If you look at this, like historically how technology is developed, usually scalability comes at the cost of privacy or vice versa. Privacy technically, you know, slows down systems. And so how do we think about making sure that both could be achieved if you were to have like a new age money system?
Yeah. And then to the second part of the question, what are some of the challenges that you face when building in this space?
Yeah. So I think, you know, we've had the luxury of, you know, there have been companies before us. And I think one of the biggest learnings is like, don't build in a silo. it's important to work with the public sector and your customers as soon as possible in the product development cycle. I think another thing that's been really interesting is, how do you build something for institutions that are decades and hundreds of years old, but also build something that's open source? And how do you get institutions comfortable with this idea of open source technology and why it's beneficial for like the future of finance? And then I think another thing which I actually really loved, it came from a conversation with Kevin Wheel, who is now at Planet, but he used to be, head of product at Novi. He said that when you're thinking about building a product, you can't just build a product to scale. He was like, what you actually do is you start with a bunch of different kind of niche use cases, and you try and see which use cases are actually going to pull in your first 5 to 10 users. And then what you do is over time, you can test those use cases, and the ones that end up becoming more relevant to who you're working with, those use cases thread together to build a much larger scalable company. So I think that's another thing of realizing that when you're trying to rebuild a system, like all we're thinking about is like, scale. But you can't actually start there. You have to reverse engineer it into kind of like the smaller things, because there's so many iterations and levels of feedback and collaboration that need to be done. And your assumption of like the knowledge that you already have is constantly being challenged.
Yeah, and that's such an important product principle too, of just making sure that you are really solving people's problems, and that starts small, and you'd rather completely solve a problem for a small group of people rather than slightly solve something for millions of people. And then once you learn about that and you find the value, then that's when you kind of can think about scale. One thing that I love that Knox is working on and that you touched on is the importance of public sector collaboration. And I think right now in Web3 and crypto, there's just this idea that government doesn't get it. These public sector groups just are so behind on times, but would love to kind of hear your response of how do you work with public sector to help bring them on this journey with you?
Yeah, I think it first starts with basic education, but not education only of us being like, here's what we're designing and here's, what we're piloting. It also starts with education for us as well. Going into the room and being like, what do you know so far? What's like the heat map of how everyone feels about what is out there, what's been presented, who supports what and why, and what are the problems that you're trying to solve. I think kind of coming in with an open mind first has been very helpful in a lot of the public sector conversations we've had. And then I think a second step to that is then introducing what we're working on, why it's different, and what we hope to achieve. And I think like any, I think in tech, we get so stuck in the product and the product build, which is obviously highly important, and product-led organizations, work incredibly well. But I think, like most businesses, a lot of this public sector collaboration starts from it's relationship-based, and like making sure that those relationships are done early and often so that as you grow, people can understand and learn and grow with you. Versus, building something in a silo for 5 years and then popping out and being like, we'll ask for forgiveness. I feel like that sometimes works when it's maybe a specific product, but when you're trying to sort of fundamentally change different parts of a system, you can't necessarily like pop out at the end and then ask for forgiveness. I believe personally, it's a personal take that doesn't work. And I even see it with some of the work that, we've done through Stanford, or, even some of the high level stuff at Bretton Woods. I think at Stanford, we're working with the UN on standards and research to support the policy. At Bretton Woods, it's sort of how do we think about these these topical briefs and events, and framing the conversation from being, to being proactive from being reactive. I think so much of the public sector is always like in reactive mode. How do we get them to start helping think about things from a proactive perspective? And from a lot of even some of the work that we did at Cello and at Stanford, I think what we realized is like probably like 3-4 years ago, a lot of the conversations on digital currencies, like, well, what are the policies? And if you really think about it, policies created reactively. you need to test, understand technology and use cases before you create policy and before it comes to fruition. So like really thinking about how do you promote technology creation and smaller pilots and data gathering, so then that data can be used to kind of make more just like better targeted policy, and you can have more productive conversations instead of like sitting in a room and saying this new technology is coming, what are the policies for it going to be? It's like that's not really how it works.
Awesome. And I know you touched on what you're doing with Stanford or Bretton Woods, but would love for you to just share a little bit more about either of those experiences and kind of some of the exciting work that's happening there.
Yeah. So, I mean, Bretton Woods is still at the very beginning of its year. So I think it's at this point, like setting the agendas for like, what are the briefs, what are the events to come, et cetera. And they work very closely with other organizations like the World Bank, IMF, and a lot of the people within Washington. I think on the Stanford side, that feels really exciting. So we, have done some fundraising. We sort of have a membership. So different companies and institutions can be members of Stanford FDCI. We host a lot of different like webinars, conferences, and now are actually hiring. We just finalized a new executive director, and we're basically hiring for different PhD students, master students, and people that might want to be working on this full time. So like a program manager, a product manager, to start to work with a lot of the research that's being done within Stanford to say, okay, if we want to start like thinking about building this out, commercializing it or testing it, having some people come and actually support that work. So feel really excited about that. It's just so funny, like nothing can happen without money. So like all of last year was mostly focused on fundraising and sort of like defining like, what do we want to offer a membership? And now we can kind of like act on that, if that makes sense. And I know the UN, separately has been doing a ton of different, papers and talking through systems architecture and stuff like that. But I think Stanford's hoping to have like a more active and vocal voice, not that we're a little bit more set up.
Awesome. Yeah, that's so exciting. And for all those listening, they're hiring, and it seems like across Web3, there are people that are looking for product talent and just talent overall. Let's kind of shift to that area and just at what stage do companies like this bring on product talent, and what are some of the skills that you look for when you're hiring for product?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this varies, but I think once products are actually well defined and the first eng team is sort of built out, I think that's when you bring in your first product person. You might be at a point where you're maybe planning or releasing developer docs or, starting to think about doing a pilot with an external party. So like, that's, sort of where we're sort of like, we want to, put together proper developer documentation. That's a big part of being open source. And a lot of different projects in Web3 are actually open source, which is great. And as we're thinking about starting to do, back to my thing of like small niche use cases, as we're starting to think about different pilots and starting to gather data, having product people in those situations is very helpful. I think, Web3 in general lacks like Web3 companies usually lack good documentation and organization, and product managers can be very helpful here. And I really do think that it's in my belief that most open source projects should be thinking about bringing in technical product people, especially sooner in the development process, because you can sort of be a liaison between all the different engineers that are building, maybe the external parties that you'll have to work with, and the developer communities. You now have like this third kind of pot of people that you wouldn't normally have in regular companies.
And so when you're writing a job description for product managers, what are kind of the specific skills that you're looking for, and how can an early PM kind of sell themselves and set them up for success in those types of roles?
Yeah. So I think like, if I had been a PM for a while and I'm saying, okay, like what is this Web3 madness? I would come into it and say, okay, I'm going to do my company research. I'm going to understand what I'm walking into. I mean, that's just first, do the basics there. Sometimes you're going to be walking into organizations that have a hierarchy, some like Meta, for example, would be a good example of that. But there's a lot of smaller companies and startup communities that don't have a lot of hierarchy. And especially within, the crypto community, hierarchy, some people are allergic to that, right? So these organizations look quite different than maybe some of the organizations that more structured PM programs have. I think the second is, think about what you're doing today and think about how that can be repackaged to support the needs of Web3. So if I'm talking from like my perspective, I'm thinking, okay, like for me, I think our organization really needs, developer documentation for the developer communities we hope to build in, et cetera. And documentation is a big part of what product managers have to do. This might be a different type of documentation, but okay, that's a skill I have. How do I rebrand it again for Web3? Oh, a lot of Web3 companies have these developer communities they want to cater to. How can I be helpful with that? Another one is being an external liaison to partners and thinking about how am I not only interfacing inside, but how can I actually be a liaison to external partners and technology providers that we might be using. And so someone who can kind of balance both, just because your product doesn't mean you need to be sitting on, behind company lines, you should also sell what you can be doing, more outward facing and more on like the partnership side. And also selling your ability to interface with different types of institutions. So, partners the types of partnerships I think you see in Web3 are a lot more diverse than maybe specific like Web2, like your classic enterprise SaaS companies. So I think that's something to be thinking about. And then I think the last thing is that good technical talent is really hard to come by in Web3, because a lot of what's happening is that engineers are also having to reskill themselves. So as a product manager, I think sort of showing the different types of communities or the people that you can bring in, not only within different product orgs, but even on the engineering side, that can actually say like, here's how I could actually be helpful in kind of positioning us as a company and bringing in people from my network that are like of higher quality, skill set. That can also be that's not in a traditional product manager role description, but I do think it's actually very, very helpful because that's something that a lot of smaller companies are struggling with as they try and scale up.
Yeah, one thing that's definitely clear from talking to people in the space is that the PM role isn't kind of the traditional one and you're wearing several hats. And so it doesn't matter what that extra value add is, but as long as you're kind of thinking outside the box a little bit and thinking about what is your like kind of personal story and value that you can bring to the team, that is really important beyond typical.
I think like something that I would do is if you're a product person looking to pivot into Web3, talk to different startups and ask them like, what are some of their biggest obstacles within product engineering in general? Understand and try and get pattern recognition after talking to a few different startups or, people that you would be potentially working for. And then you can start to see like, okay, like here's the skill sets I have today. And here are the problems that these companies are trying to solve. How can I kind of, again, repackage these skills to help show that I can be helpful to helping solve those problems?
Yeah.
Do a little bit of user research. It's sort of, It's very meta. Do user research for your job description, basically.
Yeah. PM your job.
PM your job. Yeah.
That's so important and great advice. I will ask one more question before I hand it over to the audience. We talked a little bit at the beginning of the session just about bringing more women into the Web3 space. And I'm curious to just get kind of your advice of some communities that you have found to be really supportive of helping that.
Yeah. There's one that stands out to me called She 256, a play off of SHAF 256. It started by a group of amazing women out of Berkeley. And this community has grown to be extremely large and has evolved and has been actually a very helpful place, even for myself. This community can help you with a lot of different things. I mean, you name it, if you have a question about anything in the space, this community has a channel for it, has support system for it, et cetera. And the people and the leaders of this community, I think, are really entrenched and dedicated to their work. So I just have nothing but great things to say about that community.
That's awesome. We'll definitely check it out. Also want to plug in We3, which is another amazing community for women interested in learning more about Web3. And you can check them out on Twitter at hello_We3. But yeah, it's really promising to see the emergence and kind of more awareness around this space. So thank you so much for all that great advice. I'm going to hand it over to people in the audience that have questions. So just feel free to raise your hand and then unmute yourself and ask questions. Cool. We have one from Amit.
Hi, I want to understand, is this the thing that you're working on at Stanford, is this like, you said it's crypto adjacent, but it's not sponsored by the US government or anything, CBDC. But is it like a collaboration effort between Stanford and the US government, or is this something completely private that you're working on?
Let me
programmable
actually
money?
just re-explain that, because maybe that was confusing to people. So when I said crypto adjacent, I was talking about Knox. Knox is a private company. It's completely separate of the work at Stanford. It's, a smaller startup that is basically a year old. Stanford, on the other hand, is sort of has built this, like, again, to your point, a collaboration and a partnership of sorts between the UN, Stanford, and a bunch of different banks and private companies. And they're kind of focused on thinking through what does future digital currency look like? How can we be thinking about setting standards? How can we be thinking about privacy, interoperability? A lot of the same things that most private companies in the space are thinking about, but from a research specific perspective. And it's sort of a neutral body, if you will. Stanford is trying to create a neutral body where, like, people can kind of come together and collaborate on these points. And so in no way is Stanford ever going to be like, we've built something and like now everyone needs to use it. I think it's just more of like a hub, if you will, for these discussions. In the same way you have MIT Digital Currency Initiative. Stanford is sort of like, it's different, but it's within the same sort of value system, if that makes sense.
Awesome. Thanks for
Okay, thank you, Natalya.
Cool. We have Kaushal next.
Awesome. First of all, thanks so much for coming out, kind of giving this like TLDR on your career and your interest in Web3. Really appreciate it. So quick question here. So given the lack of robust legal infrastructure in the space and regulations, how do you navigate that as a small company, especially with like building credibility with like larger parties in public kind of domains?
Yeah. So I think this is twofold. I think the first is in the structure of how we're looking at our technology, it is made to sit within the current regulatory and financial confines of different countries and financial systems. Again, I'll say, like, we're not issuing Knox, now I'm talking about Knox specifically, we're not issuing like a new asset or like a new stable coin or anything like that. All we're allowing any bank who has a set of legal reserves to map their digital assets into a programmable system and then offload that back into their digital system. So you can think of us as a software technology layer of sorts. So that in of itself, and that has, that took like 3 years of sitting in these rooms and saying, okay, we need to design something that is going to be able to sort of have the reach that we want it to have and like the feasibility that we want to be able to engage in the system. So that's like the first part. But there's a second part to your point that like you still do have to think about regulatory and legal and how people are going to perceive what you're building. And I think a lot of that work, again, is done in making sure you're talking to your customers and the different entities early and often in the product development cycle. And also working with different sort of, international organizations or other organizations that are promoting, technology sprints or pilots that are bringing together these people and can add more legitimacy to what you're doing. So instead of me just like walking out and being like, hey, like we're going to run a pilot in, the backyard of Stanford, it's sort of like working with these institutions that are bringing other players to the table. And so those institutions also give you credibility. Who you work with gives you credibility. So that's a lot of what we've been doing as well.
Cool. And can I ask a quick follow-up on that? Mary, is
yeah.
that okay? Okay. So I guess given that, since you have to loop in a bunch of different stakeholders early on in that process, how do you balance like the speed of getting those responses and like how it blocks your development? Because I assume that, you know, for a startup, you want to scale pretty quickly, but if you're working with these public institutions, it'll probably block a lot of your development if it takes a long time to get responses back, right?
Yeah. So that is a great question. I think a lot of what we're doing is we're starting with commercial banks. And so we're starting with private institutions in terms of some of the conversations that we want to have. Separately of that, there are other institutions like the Digital Dollar Project, for example, or even like FinCEN and stuff that they themselves are actually putting out bids to say like, hey, you know, like come and help us out. Like here, you know, we have some interesting problems for people to work on. And so they're not slow to response. They're actually helping lead the charge, you know, in the right direction with like the public sector. I think that in terms of the relationships where, to your point, you might reach out and you might not hear back for a while, those are slow and steady. It's being really creative about how you're reaching out, who you're talking to, who knows someone. Again, going back to my point about it all being relationship based at some point, is reaching out and sort of, I guess, like cookie crumbing it for people. So every time you're reaching out, there's something new or something more that you can add to the conversation. And a lot of it is also asking them what they need help with. And so it's not just like a one-way relationship, it becomes a bi-directional relationship. But I think overall, I do kind of agree with you. And that's why, you know, our strategy is completely different, is like, you know, we're not starting with central banks. I think that central banks are going to need a lot of help and guidance along the way. And like, we don't want to be, you know, sitting in a position where we don't have the ability to, you know, build and run and test. And so I think like your first steps are really important from a business perspective.
Awesome.
Cool.
We will take one last question from McCoy.
Hello, thanks for the time. I'm curious, like it sounds like you're working with financial institutions, how you're thinking about like financial inclusion in relation to this space, because like historically, banks specifically have taken advantage of like minority groups, press groups, and cryptocurrencies offer an opportunity to like improve that, but also it can lead to potential exploitation as well. So how do you think about that as you're sort of a leader in the space?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to financial inclusion, the few things that we're focused on are this idea that our technology is not an account-based system. So you don't necessarily need an account with a bank, even though we might be starting with banks, it can be an account-based, like even though we're starting with banks as partners, doesn't mean that our system is account-based, if that makes sense. So I think like building a technology that can be run through people who are banked and unbanked. So that's something we're looking at. We're also looking at offline transactions. This is something that also hasn't necessarily been, you know, done or is being looked at. Like I think MIT DCI is also looking at this. Offline transactions are really hard, but can be very, very helpful from this perspective of financial inclusion, right? If you're sitting in a zone where you don't have access to Wi-Fi or you still want to send a payment and receive something, like how do you enable that? So that's something that we're definitely, you know, very excited about. I think probably another one is thinking through this idea of like digital identity and how zero knowledge proofs play into that. So for example, today, a lot of people who don't have, or I guess let me explain it this way. Our goal is to make sure that our consumers are able to own their data. And when they share that data, it's done so in a privacy enabled way. So you can verify that someone is someone or they have X amount of money in their wallet, but you don't need that information to all be sent. You know, through mechanisms and privacy encryption techniques such as zero knowledge proofs, you can actually say, hey, I'm verified. Yes, that's Natalya. We can make a transaction, but it doesn't require me to actually have to like expose all of my information. I guess like a really like silly dumbed down example of it is, you know, when you go to a bar and you show them your ID. They're just trying to check if you're over 21. But when you show them your ID, they get a lot of other information. They get your address, they get like a bunch of other statistics that like they don't need to really see. So the idea of a zero knowledge proof is to sort of say, hey, you could verify that I'm over 21, but you wouldn't actually have to see all of that information. So why is that important for financial inclusion? It's important because there is definitely different types of people that come from different types of backgrounds with different types of information or verification access. And so being able to say, how can we verify different types of people at different tiers of payments, right? If a transaction is less than a threshold or less than A to B or B to C, that we can allow different transaction methods at different identity verification levels. And actually, China's digital yuan system is actually doing this as well. So like, that's also something like we've been looking into.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for all the great questions. I'm sure we could chat for hours, but Natalya, thank you for spending your evening with us. Any closing thoughts or things you want to plug? I know Knox is hiring and I shared the description in the chat and it'll be on the YouTube. Anything else to stay connected with you?
No, it was great meeting everyone and thanks for all the great questions. And I hope this was helpful. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining. Bye, everyone.